So hello everybody, this is now recorded. Today we're going to look at some things we have not looked over last time, but mostly we're going to look at the modern CSS layout mechanisms, as well as some other things like animations and stuff. So from our one of the last examples last time, we saw something in which we could lay out some divs by considering them dimensionable characters on a line, right? We just made them display inline block, and then they tended to rearrange themselves on different lines and so forth. Now this mechanism has potential in the sense that um, one of the main drivers of the evolution of CSS is the fact that devices from which CSS is on which CSS is used to render are more and more diverse, right? So if I think about the mobile phone versus a desktop, I'm going to have a lot of difference in display capability. Right? A mobile phone is going to have a lot less screen real estate. And we have to have a solution for this because we want to have one code base for all devices. And we have a couple of solutions, possible solutions. One of them is to have reflowable interfaces. So interfaces which rearrange themselves depending on the size of the screen. And the second one is to have some sort of conditional rendering logic. And we have both of them and we'll see them today. But first things first. So starting from the the idea of treating divs like characters on a line, we're going to look at something else, which is instead of doing that, we're going to use a more modern mechanism, which is called flex. Now, flex itself, just like grid, is a possible value of the display property. But it doesn't behave like the other values. So when I think about display block or display inline block or display inline or display table cell or something like that, I'm talking about displaying myself. Right? It's how I behave. I am a block. I am a character-like thing. I am a resizable character-like thing, and so forth. Um, but in the case of flex and grid, I don't actually refer to myself. Rather, I refer to my children. Now, this does make a lot of sense because if I think about how I would abstract any graphical user interface, I'd probably go with something which is called a container component pattern. Right? So I describe the interface as being a tree in which some nodes are containers and the leaves of the tree are components. Right? So a node can contain other containers and they can contain other containers, and ultimately I'm going to get to the component. So it's a container component pattern. So it makes sense to be able to specify something about my children. And this is what we're going to do with flex. So first things first, let's go through a couple of examples. So right, one sec. Let's just get to our thing. So let's start from a simple document, and let's have a container which contains a bunch of components. Right. And we're just going to have 7 of them for starters. And we're gonna have a style block. Right. So first things first, let's have our components be so at the start of our thing of our layout. It's going to look like this. So they're just divs and they're displayed one under the other and so forth. So not really all that interesting. So let's make them be something. So component. So let's say they're little squares. So they have a width of 300 pixels, a height of 300 pixels, and they have a background color, and they have a border. and let's also say box sizing border box, because we don't want the border to affect our dimensions. Now this is something else we're going to talk about today, which is what do I measure in CSS and how do I measure it, right? So if I say what can I specify the size of, right? And I have some relative measurements and some absolute measurements. We're going to go back to this when we run into them. So for now, what I get is a bunch of little squares, one over the other. And we know we can reflow this to be a line by making them inline blocks. But we're going to do something different today. But first, let's do something else. Let's observe that I have a margin here, right? And if I inspect this, I'm going to see that the cause for this is the fact that body has a default style which says margin 8 pixels. We're generally going to take this out just so it looks better. One sec. Right. So what we're going to do is we're going to say that our container has display flex. Now this isn't going to do much for us because what we're going to get is all the little boxes on one row, but we see that our little boxes can actually resize themselves, right, by default. But we don't actually want this. What we want is to have them on a wrappable row. So this didn't happen because we need to add something else, which is we need to specify something. If I think about the components in a flex container as being similar to characters on a line, I have to specify a couple of things. One of them is the direction of these characters, right? Because if I think about the uh, European way of writing, it's something which comes from the left to the right and from top to bottom. But there's other systems of writing which don't necessarily have the same direction, which is why for regular text I can specify the direction the text is aligned. You know, the text, the direction the text progresses in. So I have to specify that, and I'm going to say flex flow. This is a composite property, so it's going to be row, the opposite of this being column, and wrap. That is, if the text doesn't fit on a line, it's going to be wrapped to the next line. So I get something a bit better. Right, so now this behaves exactly like the inline block characters behaved on a line. But I can do some additional things with flex, which is why I have display flex. So the first thing I might want to do is to say justify content center. Now what this is going to give me is our pseudo characters are going to align horizontally to the center. Now horizontally is actually a misnomer because since we have different directions the pseudo text might go in, instead of having a horizontal and a vertical, I have a main axis and a cross axis. Right. So the main axis is going to be horizontal in this case because we're on a row, and the cross axis is going to be vertical. This is something else Flex is going to do for us, which is going to allow us to align stuff vertically very easily. Now, something to note about Flex is that Flex is a unidimensional way of layout. Right. So it's one dimension because it has this fiction behind it. Now, what we might want, so this looks pretty nice, but what we might want is not to have white space. So if I think about it, I might think of something which is a reflowable interface. A reflowable interface is going to be an interface. Let's say you have a dashboard and it has a lot of widgets on it. Now, if the widgets are really size sensitive, right? I can't enlarge them or shrink them in any way, or they break. There's nothing I could do in the situation. However, I might have widgets which are not that size sensitive, right? Which I can enlarge to a certain extent or shrink to a certain extent, so that I can fit them in the available space. Let's assume we're in that situation. So I'm going to say flex basis. This is how the dimensions are calculated, and I'm going to say auto. and then we're going to say flex grow 1. Now what flex grow 1 means is how much can it enlarge. In this case it can enlarge up to 100%. So if I had 0.5 it could enlarge with 50% and so forth. And if I reload this, I'm going to see it's now filled all the space. Now what's interesting is when I decrease the size of the screen, everything seamlessly rearranges. Right, so this is what flex does. Now let's assume though that we want the numbers on the cells, these numbers, to be centered. Now what we might do is, and with this we're going to see that we can have flex containers inside flex containers, or later we're going to see that we can have grid containers inside flex, flex inside grid, and so forth. So we're going to also make this display flex, and instead of using something with line height, which seems more like a workaround than a solution, we can just say justify content center and align item center. And this is going to align stuff to the center on the main axis and on the cross axis. Right, so I get the numbers in the middle. Right, so this is basically how flex works. So it's a pseudo row of characters on which I can manipulate the size of the elements I have there. Let's also, if we're here, let's also say font size 4em. Now this em business is another interesting thing, because I told you we have different things we can measure in CSS and different ways we can measure those things. So what can we measure? So the first thing we might want to measure, so first let's see what's happened here. The first thing we'd like to measure is just sizes or offsets, or so things which can be measured in numbers basically. Now here I have two giant categories of measurements, one of which is absolute measurements and one of which is relative measurements. Now absolute measurements are mostly useless. One of them is useful because this brings us to something strange about CSS, which is that CSS is designed to cover both screen rendering, what we're doing now, but also print rendering, right? So it's also designed to work for print. And a bunch of these absolute measurements have no relevance whatsoever on a screen, right? So I have picas and points and inches and centimeters, which don't really fit the computer screen model. But they do fit the paper model, right? It's printing on paper. Now, what we do need from this set of absolute measurements is pixels, obviously. Now, the second set of the measuring distances and sizes and so forth is relative measurements, right? And I have a bunch of relative measurements. One of them, however, is this, which is an EM. And an EM is going to be the height of a character. Right? So it's the height, the size in the sense of the height of a character. Now EM refers to the height of a character as I've received it from my parent. So there's an additional unit of measure, which is REM, which is root EM, which is the height of a character at document level. And I need these in different contexts, right? It depends if I want to relate to a form I'm in, or I want to relate to a standard thing in the document. Now, additionally, I have something which is called CH, so from character, and that's the width of a character. Not really all that useful, but it exists. Now, talking about relative measurements, we're going to see a couple more measurements soonish, and these all apply to heights or widths, or like I said, or distances and so forth. But I have other things I can measure. I mean, we're going to see this in different examples later on, such as angles or durations. Right, so this is the basics of Flex. Now let's look over grid. Now, if Flex considers my components as being characters on a line, basically, and it's a way of laying things out in a single dimension, I have grid, which is a way of laying things out in two dimensions and considers my drawable area as being or any drawable area, any rectangle, any rectangle I might define, which is a grid, considers it as a grid in the sense that it has a bunch of columns and a bunch of rows. And the cells of my grid are going to be the intersection between a row and a column. Now this very much looks like I lay things out with a table of sorts. However, again, this is more flexible. Now, grid interfaces are not reflowable, right? So I might want to have a little grid inside a flow, but they play a different role. Now, CSS evolved also due to, let's say, innovations in derived libraries. So if you look at something like Twitter Bootstrap, you're going to see that Twitter Bootstrap has something which is close to a grid at its center, which is it considers that the interface is formed of a series of rows, and each of the row has 12 columns. Uh, Now grid is actually a bit less limiting than that, and it's a bit more flexible. So let's just make a grid, and we're going to make it in a complicated fashion and a simplified fashion. All right, so we need an HTML. And we're going to use the content, right? So the structure of the HTML is going to be the same as it was here. So the first thing is we want to say that our container is a grid. Again, we're telling the browser something about our children, not about ourselves. So the container is display grid. Now, if we're also going to style the component a bit, just so we see something, which is gonna give it it's basically the same thing. So it's border sizing, the border box, background color orange, etc. Right, so to look at this in the initial form, it looks like this. Now why though? We said we have a grid, this doesn't look like a grid. Well, the reason for this, and let's not forget so that it looks better, body, margin, 0px. Right. Why though? Because we have not defined, we said it's a grid, but we have to define how many columns and how many rows. So we're going to say grid template columns. And here we're going to say another way of measuring things, which is relative, which is 25%. Now 25% of what? It's 25% of in this case, the width of my parent. Then we're going to see what we're going to say here, and again 25%. And since we've specified these, in the middle we can write auto, because it can be auto calculated. In fact it's 25, 50, 25, but we've not written the 50. And then we're going to have grid template rows as the same thing. And now, since we've written this, we can go here and see what happens. Well, something happens. But let's do something else. Let's say the container actually has a height equal to the viewport height. Now this is another way of measuring things. Now the viewport is this visible part in the browser, and what I'm doing now is shrinking the viewport, for example. Now I have two units of measurement, one which is VH, viewport height, and the viewport height is 100 VH, which means that 1 VH is 1% of the viewport height. And then I have VW, which is viewport width. And again, the same applies, which is the total width is 100 VW, and then 1 represents 1%. We're going to say that the height is 100 VH. Now, interestingly enough, if we comment the margin on the body, 100 VH isn't going to fit on the screen, right? Because what I need now is 100 plus 2 times the margin of the body. So that's why I commented the body margin. Right, so it looks like this. So what happened is that all of my components fit in the grid, and they just went in the grid wherever they found a place to fit, right? So it's in the order of the areas in the grid. Now, we might not want that, so what we can do is we can let me just copy paste this because it's going to be a bit harder to write. So we can specify what column things started and what column things ended, right? So for example, for C1, it's going to be something like this. And if we just look at C1, we forgot to put the class for C1. Sorry, one sec. We forgot to put the class for C1. We're gonna put it here. Okay, so now we can look at this and see that what we've got, what we've obtained is now the first C1, the first component, occupies 2 cells. And we can specify this as long as we specify a rectangular area. Now, we can also elect to skip a zone and so forth, which means in the end, let me just take the whole thing. We're going to get something like this. Let's just delete these for now. Right, so C1, C2. The problem with this is it's really hard to read. I couldn't look at this and without rendering it, imagine how it looks. Now, how it looks is like this. I've just elected to leave an empty area here, but not really all that fun. So we have another way of defining this, which is a bit easier to parse by a human. But if we do have another way which is easier to parse, why do we have this one? What's it good for? Well, it's good for the situation where I want to generate a grid automatically from code. And I've actually run into the situation. Think about it like this. Say you have a bunch of students and a bunch of homeworks, and the students are the lines, the homeworks are the columns, and at the intersection of a line and a column, I might have nothing, or I might have a relatively complex component. Now, what I might do is feed the data to something which generates this representation, and that's going to visually give me a grid. So this is why these are here. Now, but let's simplify this for a bit, and let's say we start from this file. And we're going to delete all this stuff, we don't care. And we're going to write it a bit simpler. Now, the way we might go about this is instead of defining what happens to each column, what we're going to do is we're going to go to the parent here. Let's just move this a bit further up. I'm going to say grid template areas. So since we have a bunch of row column intersections, we're just going to name them. But we have some flexibility in how we name them. Now this property looks a bit strange in the sense that it's actually 3 strings. And we're going to call them left top. Now the next area I don't actually need. I want to leave it empty. So I'm going to just put a point. This one is without anything special. And on the bottom, what I want to have is a 2 column 1 row rectangle which represents one area. Right, so how did that help me? Well, what I can do now is take each component and just say where it fits. So C1 is grid area left top. C2 is grid area, right top, and so forth. Let me just copy them actually, so we just so this one is going to be left middle, left mid. This one is going to be and this one is useless. Right, so left mid, center, right mid, left bottom, right bottom. I think it's correct. So now, if we go to 3, we're going to get really something really similar. Right, so I can see that there's a 7 occupies this whole area, this one is empty, and so forth. I can do something else. Let's go to our grid, and I can leave some space between my columns. I'm gonna say grid column gap 10 pixels and grid row gap 10 pixels. So now we get a bit of spacing between them. Additionally, what I might want to say is, let's say for the center one, I want to have centering for the content. Now I can easily, which was that for, I can easily say something like display flex. I can have a flex display, justify content center, align items center. Right, so I can easily use a flex display inside the grid. This is going to work out. Right, so this is basically how a grid would work. Obviously, we can do this for each of these containers. We're just not gonna do it because there's no reason to. Now, I said that what I can do with Flex is to have reflowable interfaces, and it's a good idea to have reflowable interfaces because I might need to display that interface on a device which has significantly less screen space than a desktop computer. Now, this is going to fix some of my problems, but not all of my problems. What happens if either my components are sensitive to resizing, so I can't resize them automatically, or if I want to have some sort of radical difference, right? Such as my desktop application has a menu, but on mobile I don't want to show the menu. Rather, I want to not display the menu and have a one of those burger menus, and if I press it, I'm going to have an overlay, right? So it's something radically different. Now, if I do have something radically different, I have another mechanism which I can use, which is called CSS Media Queries. Now, to talk about media queries, first off, I have some set of CSS clauses which are called @, clauses. Right, so they start with an @ sign, and these allow me to do various things, such as they allow me to import stuff from another CSS file. They allow me to include a font, an external font, but they also allow me to have conditional logic, right? So conditional logic in CSS. So let's just see a simple example of media queries, and then we're going to have an actual layout which is going to modify itself. So first things first, what is a media query going to look like? So we need the simplest possible thing. So we're gonna say body, I am the body. I'm gonna say that the body has background color light blue. However, we want to add some additional rules which are only going to apply under certain conditions. So we can use an add rule. So add media screen. Now this relates to the fact that I said that CSS actually also refers to print. But from a mobile versus desktop distinction, it has no significance whatsoever. I'm gonna say add media screen and max width, and let's say our device is 300 pixels wide. And now we're just going to write our rule, which is going to be similar to what we had here. We're just going to make everything orange. Now, the way I have to look at this is this block doesn't exist unless the condition is fulfilled. If the condition is fulfilled, it's like I'd just have, it's like I wouldn't have the condition, just I'd have the rules in the file. Which means the reason why when the condition is fulfilled, the reason why the document is going to become, the body of the document is going to become orange, is actually the fact that this rule has a selector of the same specificity and it comes later. Right? That's the reason. It just appeared in the document. So let's see what happens. So for now it's blue, but if we keep shrinking the viewport, at some point it's going to become orange. Right, so I can do this, it's cool, but what's it good for? Well, let's see this over a somewhat more relevant example, right? That we want to see it over something which actually reflows. So let's consider a minimal interface. And let me just find something. So let's consider we have this HTML file, and we're going to explain it shortly. Right, so I have a container which contains a menu and the content part. And the menu contains a bunch of menu items and so forth. So let's first style it for desktop. It's obviously not really complex, so it's not going to be all that difficult. Right, so let's also have a body background color light green, and let's say our container is, and this time we're going to leave the margins in place for now, 100%, which is 100% of my parent. Right, let's say the menu is a side menu, so height 100%. It's floating, and let's say it has a padding of 20 pixels. Right, so we have a little layout. Let's just see it. And we can already see what the problem is, right? So here it makes sense. So the idea would be that I click some of this stuff and it loads something here. We obviously don't have the actual logic, so we can just think about how it looks. But at some point it doesn't make sense anymore. It becomes something like this. So at this point where I'm on a mobile device, I might want it to look a bit different, which is I'd like to for these menu items to become full length, full width, right, to occupy the whole width. And the selected text is going to come under that, under the buttons. Right. So let's do this. And obviously we're going to need a media query. So you're going to say the condition is similar to add media max width all right, so we're gonna also change the, just as a signal, the color of the body. But more interestingly, we're gonna say menu is no longer floating, and we're gonna use text align for now. We don't want to overcomplicate things, and content has less padding. Right, so let's start from the desktop variant. So we're gonna say this. This is fine. This is fine. This is fine. But at some point, the interface simply reflows itself. Right, so this is why I'd use media queries. Um, I also have media queries for browser APA support, so I have an UT supported and so forth. I also have not media queries, also have UT rules with for supported. I also have UT rules for animations. We're gonna see them soonish. So there's a great variety of it. Now media queries themselves are basically device-based ifs in CSS, right? Radio. Now let's go back to grids for a bit and talk about talk about one measurement, one way of measuring things which you've not talked about, and also talk about CSS functions and so forth. So first of all, let's talk about CSS functions. What would a CSS function be or do? Now let's consider the following situation. We're going to go and create a new file. And let's say we have a div which is called menu or something. I am a thin line. And we have a div which is called content. And it says I take up the rest of the screen. Now, the first thing which might ring alarm bells here is that it says the rest of the screen, right? So let's look at menu first. So let's say menu has a height of 50 pixels, and it has a background color just so we can better identify it. Now, what would the rest of the screen mean? Because I don't necessarily know how tall the screen is, right? So it's whatever the height of the screen was minus 50 pixels, right? So what I'd like to say is content is whatever has a height of whatever the size was, 100% for example, minus 50 pixels. Unfortunately, I can't actually write this. But what I can write is use a CSS function, which is going to be calc. Right, so this is one example of a CSS function. Now, CSS functions do various things. So in this case, I'm going to have calc. In the next example, I'm going to have repeat. So these do something mathematical in essence. But they all do something mathematical in essence. But these do stuff like adding or subtracting or repeating dimensions. But I can also have CSS functions which do more complex things, such as they perform rotations or they perform complex transformations which contain rotations, translations, and so forth. But first things first, let's look at our example. Okay, let's also do and have this as viewport height. Right, so I could easily calculate stuff based on the rest of the screen. Now something else to note. You've maybe noticed, not in Sublime what I'm using now, but in Visual Studio Code, that whenever you created a file, it added something like this. So it was meta name viewport. It added a meta tag. Now the reason for this, and it's actually really useful, is that mobile browsers lie about the viewport height and the viewport width. And this makes them not lie. Right, so if I use on a mobile device, if I use viewport height or viewport width in calculations, I should probably have a meta viewport. Right, so what does this have to do with the grid? Now we'll go back to our grid. And now I'm jumping around a bit and see a couple of examples which relate to generating columns sort of automatically, columns or lines. Right, so let me see if I can find the actual HTML. Right, so I have the HTML and it's going to have a couple of containers. And they say something which is not necessarily how it's going to stay, but this is the initial state. Right, so I have this is a container which is going to be a grid. It's going to have just one line, but a bunch of columns. And the columns are going to function like this. So the first one is going to be 30% of its parent. Fine. The second, the last one is going to be 100 pixels. And the other four are going to split the space equally. Now this is somewhat hard to calculate, right? Because it's 100 something, 170% minus 100, right, divided by 4. It's not that it's hard to calculate for us, but it's going to be really hard to read when we look over it. So let's style container one. Obviously it's a grid. And we're gonna say grid template columns. We don't need to say grid template rows because we're gonna get one row. And we're gonna write something else. We're gonna say 30%. That's fine. Repeat of something, and then 100 pixels, because the last one is supposed to be 100 pixels. Let's also do some other things. Let's say grid gap is going to be 5 pixels. And let's have a background color. And let's have a height for the whole thing. And the width is going to be 100% either way. But we can write it explicitly if we want. Right, so what do we do here? Well, we're gonna say it's something 4 times, right? Because these 4 are identical. So it's 4 times 1 FR. Now this FR, it's a fraction, and it goes like this. So I'm repeating something 4 times, and the space I have available is however much space I have available, what was calculated. So what each of these is going to take up is their share of that space, right? Because if, for example, I would have taken less than my share of that space, I would have said 0.5 FR. We're going to see this shortly, but let's look at this first. Let's have some borders. It's impossible to see. So container div, I'm going to say background color. That's in, oh, let's see if it's visible now. Container 1, sorry. Right. So I can now see what the containers, what space the containers take. Right. So 30%, a quarter of whatever was left, and this is fixed width. Now I can actually use a more complex parameter for this this repeat CSS rule. So let's do this. And do the same for container 2. Now for container 2, what it says it's going to do is I have a 30% thing, and then I no longer have the last one, which is 100, but what I do have is a quarter of what's left, an eighth of what's left, quarter, eighth, quarter. So how I might write this as, let's just put it light green. Is I'm going to repeat 2 times but instead of 1 FR, I'm going to say I have a 1 FR, then I have a 0.5 FR, and at the end I have a 1 FR. Right? Because that's how it works. It's quarter, eighth, quarter, eighth, quarter. And if I look at this now, now, what did I do? I container 2. And if I look at this now, right, let's also change the, right. I can see I got something which follows that rule, right? So it's a quarter, eighth, quarter, eighth, quarter. Right, so I can use this this repeat thing. Now, something else we want to look at before we continue is apart from grids and flex, from grid and flex, I have another modern mechanism, layout mechanism, which doesn't work on the same principle, right? It's not tied to display. It is tied to the same way of thinking in the sense that I have a parent which defines the behavior of its children. So this is going to be something which is called the column layout. This is something we're going to run into frequently, which is displaying text or objects on multiple columns. So let's have a div container, and it contains a bunch of divs, and they contain a bunch of text. Let me just find a bunch of text. Now what we want to say here is we're going to say container is a column container. Now the way this look like by default is obviously like a bunch of divs one under the other. Right? Nothing special. So column count is going to be 3. Now, as soon as we've written this, things rearrange themselves on columns. Now I can do something else, which is I can say column gap. Let's let's have it at 20 pixels. And this is just hopefully visibly going to distance them. It's not that visible, but they're farther apart now. And I can also use something of a visual indicator. So column rule 5 pixels. Sorry, 5 pixels. Right. Now, something else I might notice though is if I try to resize this, it's going to insist to be on 3 columns even if it doesn't make sense. So what I can do is I can specify a minimal size for the column. So I'm going to say column width. And if we get below that, it's just going to give up the column. Apparently not. Why? I didn't reload it, I think. Right. So right now I have no columns, but if I enlarge this, right, when I go over what's needed, the columns appear. So it's also an auto reflowable thing. Let me just pause this, and if you have any questions, we'll record it again. Now, this sort of wraps up the, let's say, the modern layout mechanisms, but there's a bunch more relevant stuff. We've seen functions, right, in CSS, but we have something else which is also connected to functions, which is we have variables. Now, why would I want that? Now, let's imagine we've built this neat little product which has a bunch of pages, awesome, and we've decided that we're going to use a particular shade of green. Now that particular shade of green is not necessarily a named color, so we have it written as a hex number everywhere. And then our product is more and more successful, and we decide to ask an artist, right, to give us the best color scheme possible. And they tell us we should use another particular shade of green. Now what we have to do is go everywhere in our application and replace the first green with the second green. And whenever you hear we have to replace everywhere in our application, we're going to miss a couple of spots. Right, so it's the equivalent of a visual bug. Now what I might do is have this generic definition of the style of the application, have it in one place. And if I have to change it to another particular shade of green, I'm going to change it in one place, right? For good or for, whether it's good or bad. Uh, I'm not saying anything about the artist. Right, so let's see how we could handle that. Now, something to note is when talking about ut rules, I have an ut rule which is called import, and I can use that. We're going to write them in the same file, but we could write them in one generic global file. We first need an HTML. And let's say we have let me just check this out. Let's say we have the following structure. We have div.content, and we have an h1, and we have a little form. The form contains 2 buttons. And one says yes and now one says no. Now something which we might do in our application is we might decide that everything that is a positive action is colored in a particular way, and everything which is a negative action is colored in a different way. We're actually stealing a bit from Twitter Bootstrap, which is organized in the same fashion. So what we're going to do is we're going to define the style of our application, and then if we want to have a button in the style of our application, we're going to say class btn. And now we could say btn positive or something, but we're going to assume things are positive. And only if they're not positive, we're going to put an additional class. Right, so we'd like to define these ideas somewhere central, like I said. So first things first, where would we define them? Right, if I do have these variables, where would I put them? Well, I could put them into something like this. Oh no, into a selector which is called HTML, which is the document itself. However, again in modern CSS, I have a pseudo class which is called root, which is a good fit for this because it's distinct, which is equivalent to HTML. It just has a different specificity. So let's say we have a base color, which is the background of our application. We're going to say base color. And this is the name of a variable. Notice that it starts with two minuses. And it uses the same naming scheme which is generally used in JavaScript, which is the different words are delimited by minus. So base color is going to be, this is a color. Positive color is going to be light green, for example. And the negative color is going to be some red. Right, so now we're ready to define our general approach to the application, right? So it's so I'm gonna say content, and we're gonna say background color. Well, we have to access our variable. We want to have the background color be whatever is in base color. So I'm gonna say var of base color. Now let's define our buttons. Like I said, we're going to assume that our buttons are positive. So first we're going to say background color as var of positive color. Let's see how this looks for now. So first things first, both our buttons are going to be positive for now. Second, they look horrible. Let's make them look slightly less horrible, not by much. So first thing to notice, we're going to say for all buttons, border radius is going to be 5 pixels, let's say. And we're going to say that buttons already have a border, but we want to not have a border, but rather delimit the button from the things around it by its shape. So we're going to say border 0px. And let's have some padding so the text looks better. I'm gonna say it's going to be symmetrical as in left, right, and top, bottom, but it's not going to be the same for vertical and horizontal. Now this is we do this iteratively, so we modify something, we look at our buttons and so forth. Or as for danger, we're just going to use a later rule to overwrite an earlier rule. And that, as they say, is it. Right, so we have some not great but decent buttons. So that's how I use variables. Right. Now, before going to say more obscure things, let's look over animations. Now, animations. Now, this is it's sort of true. We're going to look over transitions and animations. Now, transitions I can look at as being a simplified way of animating things, right? So, but they're not animations in the sense of the animation keyword in CSS. They're just a way of animating things. So let's look over a simple case, and we're going to notice how it works. So we're just going to have a little square. Right. So what we're going to do now is let's style the target. let's have it be height width border. Right, so this is a little square. It looks like this. Uh, okay, so now we want to put something else, which is target hover. So whenever I hover the mouse over this, it's going to do something else, which is it's going to do width 400 pixels, height 400 pixels. Now this is actually going to work. However, it's going to be really uh, abrupt, right? It's going to change immediately. Now, what if we want to have it do a transition of sorts, right? To not go from start to finish immediately, but rather go through some intermediary stages. Well, we can use a property called transition, which says a duration. It takes 5 seconds. No, it says what does this transition apply to, which properties. So all 5 seconds, and then there's an easing function. Now, an easing function is something which is included, which tells me if getting from 200 to 400 takes 5 seconds, after 3 seconds, what would the value be? So let's look at this and see what we've got now, and we see it does this in a pleasant fashion, but not the other way around. If we wanted to do it the other way around as well, we could move this on the sharp target selector. I don't know how visible this is, but it does it semi nicely. So this is one way of animating things, even if it's called different. It has a different name. However, it's not really all that flexible, is it? Right? I don't have that much control over it. If I do want more control over it, what I might use is the actual animation mechanism. Now, what this does, if I think about an animation, right, how an animation works, be it in CSS or in any other place, well, an animation works by defining what happens at each frame of each of the frames of the animation. Now, generally, this is impractical, right? I can't define each of the frames. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to define some keyframes, right? And keyframes I'm going to tell the computer where the objects are supposed to be at a particular moment in the animation, right? That's what I'm going to do. So let's take our target thing. Much of it is going to be the same. I don't know what I copy pasted, so let's take everything. So we're gonna have the same little square. All that's fine. What we're going to modify is so the hover bit does no longer applies. The transition bit no longer applies. What we want to do is to use an actual animation. We're gonna say animation name, right? And we're gonna call it test. And animation duration. Let's say 5 seconds. 5 seconds. Right. Now we're referring to something we're calling test. There's no test here. We have to define it, and we use it through an add rule, which is going to be at keyframes test, and this is going to define the keyframes. Now, in its simplest form, I'm just going to say from to, or this might be written as 0% and 100%. So let's just call it margin left 90%, to margin left 10%. And if we're here, let's also have it increase in height and width. Let's see what it does. Right, so it does this, but then it abruptly stops. What might we do to have an infinite animation? Well, we could go here and modify a couple of things. I'm gonna say animation iteration count, which also has infinite, and animation direction, and this one we could say alternate. This means it's going to go in one direction, then the other, and so forth. Right, so now it seems to be working. However, again, it's not really all that impressive because we could have done this with transitions mostly. So what if we want to have more control? Let's have more control. Well, I said that we can actually replace from with 0% and to with 100%. But this leads us to the conclusion that we can also use something else. So, for example, 200%, 25%, or 50%, or 75%. So let's populate all of these and let's make a square which makes a little square, so to speak, a square which follows the trajectory on the screen. So we no longer use this margin thing. The easiest way to do this is to have a position fixed square. This no longer goes. So let's say we start from, we're gonna say top 0 px left 0 px. In the end, we're gonna also get here at the same spot where we started from. But here we're gonna say top 0 px, right 0 px, and so forth. So it's bottom right, and bottom right, and bottom left. Let's see if this works. It's 12, I guess. Well, this doesn't do anything. Let's see what's wrong.
Doesn't need to.
What? Sorry, let me pause. Right, so let me just have a different positioning scheme. I'm just gonna use something which is left top. It's the same general idea, so it should go through a little square, a little rectangle, and this time it does. See, and it's the same thing, so it's position fixed. All right, so it does this thing. Maybe it should do it slowly instead of fast, but you know, it does it in alternate directions. Okay, so that's the animation mechanism. Let's look over a couple more things, which are basically various things, right? It's not really It's they don't really fit in a particular category. So the first thing we want to look over, again in relation to functions, is transforms. So let's have a div.basic, a div.rotated, a div.skewed, and a div.rotated 3D. Right, so we want something for all divs first. Let's say it's div. So div height 100 pixels, width 100 pixels, and let's say they have the text center, so it's flex. Right, and let's distance them a bit. Let's look at it. Right, so they sort of look like this. So we could also put a margin. In fact, basic doesn't matter. So so basic is going to stay basic. Let's say div.rotated. Right, and notice that for anims we had a way of specifying time, which was in seconds. Here we have to have since it's a rotation, we have to have a way of specifying degrees or something, angles, measuring angles. So in this case, we're gonna say transform rotate 45 degrees. Now, transform is actually a helper function. There's a function which is called matrix, and there's a function which is called matrix 3D. And I can encapsulate more than one transformation because I have three classes of transformation, right? I have rotations, I have translations, and I have skewing. So rotations, and I've rotated it. We're not going to do translations, but they just modify, move the element on one of the axes. So div.skewed, I guess. Okay, so transform skew 45 degrees. Right. So I put this and rotate 3D. Now this one I'm going to have to take from somewhere because we actually have to calculate what's going to happen. So it is transform and we can also specify this as radians. Unfortunately, we don't have a thing for pi, so I've written pi by hand. So this is not really all that comfortable, but it was rotated. Right, so I can see that my functions do a bunch more things. I can have functions for a bunch more things. Now let's look at something else. Now this time, Let's assume we have a div which is called circle, and we have another div which has some content. It doesn't really matter. Let me just find a bunch of text. What's important is, however, that my div is floating. Right, it's not really all that impressive. Let's give it some heft to it. So we're gonna say that it's actually height 100 pixels. Okay, we're gonna say it's display flex. Right, so let's see how it looks right now. That's fine. It's not a circle, however. Let's make it a circle. Now, the way to do this is by saying border radius 50%. Now it's a circle. However, I can see that the text, while it wraps around it, so to speak, let's see that it wraps around it. Right, it wraps around it. It wraps around it in a square. Could it wrap around it in a circle? Well, it actually could. There's something which is called a shape. So it's something which is called a shape, and in this case, it's shape outside is a circle of 50%. Let's also give it some padding of 5 pixels, so it looks a little bit better. So right now, it actually wraps around it as a circle. Now this is a bit of a little bug, I'm guessing, because this one doesn't fit here. You can see that the text wraps around the outer shape of my div. Okay. Now the next thing we want to look over, and I think it's the last one, is how do we handle an external object which is too big, basically, right? Uh, so I plan all this neat interface, and I have some images which are generated somewhere, and one of these images doesn't fit. Now we could do this with the max width, max height, etc., but we have a more modern mechanism. So what we want to do is build our own little card. If you know how card displays work, this is going to be a card. So first, let's just have a div.container which contains an article.card, which contains a header, then we have an image, then we have the description, I don't know if we're using this for anything, but let's see. The content is going to be that text, and then we have a footer. Right, so by default it looks like this. Not interesting. Let's also find an image, and I have an image. Let me see. An image of the first personal computer. just find it. Right, so this is how it looks normally. So it's a pretty big image. It looks, you know, it's visible, but not much more. So let's see what we can do about it. So let's say that the container is limited in size. Right. Now let's say that our card is a grid actually. Right? It's a grid which only has rows. This example is based on one you can find on developer Mozilla. You can look. They have a section of layout patterns. So this is display grid, where grid template rows has 200 pixels, 1 FR. And let's have a box shadow, just so it looks a bit better. Unfortunately, it's not going to look that great. So let's also have a border, so we define it. Right, so let's see what we got. Well, sort of. We sort of have what we want, but we don't have the image first off. Let's see what we can do about the image. So the image, we can say card image is object fit scale down. Scale down to what? Well, scale down to a width of 100 of my parent and a height of 100. Well, that's the thing. Now let's style the card footer. So we're gonna say footer. Well, dot card footer is going to be, I don't know, background color black, color white, max width no, minimum height is going to be a minimum of 50 pixels, so it doesn't look too skinny, and a maximum of 100 pixels. Display flex and align everything. Right. Now this thing, the content of a card, we either limit it, or alternatively we could make it have an overflow, right? So we can scroll through it if it's too big. And the title we probably should center. And that's it. Right. So that's about it for today. I'm going to stop the recording, and then I'm going to take a few more questions if you have any.